Good evening, how are you doing? If you've been following my videos in a chronological series, you'll know that I've recently had an operation on my sinuses and my nose. So I'm banned from booze at the moment. So instead of my usual glass of malt, you join me tonight with a lovely hot chocolate with nothing to liven it up. What I'd like to do in this video, and you probably got that impression from the settings, is I'd like to carry on with the series Stories of Greatness. And this time I'm going to talk about somebody that you've probably heard of. A lot of the boxers that I've talked about, I'm guessing that you probably weren't that familiar with. But this guy is somebody that I expect you at least know the name of. He achieved a huge amount, and like many of the people we talk about, and was massively successful, and was a very unusual man, so we actually know quite a lot about him. And for that reason, I'm not even going to attempt to summarise his boxing career in one video. So all we're going to talk about today is his very early life and how he became a professional fighter. If you haven't already guessed, the person we're going to talk about tonight is none other than Daniel Mendoza. So let's get going. He was born on the 5th of July in 1764 in Aldgate in London. He was born a Sephardic Jew, and there were effectively two schools of Judaism within the UK. The Sephardic Jews and the Ashkenazi Jews, and the Sephardic Jews were very much in the minority. That being said, there weren't a huge number of Jews living in the UK at the time. Whilst it was legal to be Jewish in the UK, it certainly wasn't considered acceptable in society. There were something like 15,000 Jews living in the UK out of a population of round about 6.5 million. But to put this into context, in the 12th century, Jews were effectively banned from the country. They were forcibly killed or evicted. And it wasn't until 1656, when Cromwell was in charge, that he set a precedent. He didn't actually change the law, but he set a precedent of allowing Jews to move to the United Kingdom from Holland. And at that point, people were no longer legally prosecuted for being Jewish. However, persecution was still pretty rife. There was, in Mendoza's time, in the late 1700s, there was a lot of anti-Jewish propaganda. Shakespeare's Shylock was a hugely common caricature, and this was kind of, socially at least, kind of applied to all Jews. So Jews were frowned upon. They weren't full citizens. Even if they'd been born in the UK, like Mendoza, like Daniel Mendoza, they still weren't full citizens. They weren't allowed to become members of parliament, and they weren't even allowed to vote. Jews weren't allowed to own property unless they'd been born in the UK. Unlike people from other countries, you could move to the UK and you could own property unless you were Jewish. So whilst he didn't come from as difficult a background as someone like Tom Molyneux, there's no way we can say that Mendoza grew up in a sheltered and privileged manner, because he certainly didn't. There was a reputation at the time for Jews being money-grabbing, hoarding, and extremely rich. And clearly, in the vast majority of cases, that was hugely unfounded. Especially so with Mendoza's family. His parents weren't rich. He describes them as middle class, but when you read some of the contemporary sources at the time, you can see that this is probably a bit of a stretch. That they're at the lower end of what's considered middle class, and they weren't wealthy by any stretch of the imagination. But they valued education for their family, and they had a large family. So they spent what money they had on sending all of their children away to school, a Jewish school. And this was relatively unusual, but it meant that the children got a good education and a good start in life. And whilst Dan was at school, he learned to read and write, he learned grammar, he learned arithmetic, he learned to speak Hebrew, and it seems he learned to fight. We don't know if fighting was hugely common and Dan became good at fighting because he was involved in so many fights, or whether he was a child that liked to fight. His later life would lead us to believe that the latter is probably true. He probably liked a good scrap. And in his own words, because unlike a lot of pugilists, Dan Mendoza actually wrote his own memoirs. So when you put that together with the other sources that we normally use, people like Pierce Egan's Boxiana, Bell's Life of London, some of the pamphlets that were published at the time, and some of the later sources where people have brought together other source material, things like Fights for the Championship by Henning, Vistiana, Pugilistica, that sort of thing. We've got a huge amount of information about Mendoza. So, in his own words, he says he had lots of contests against larger boys at school. And this was to be a feature of his boxing career. And it didn't take very long for him to be regarded as the master of them all, the best fighter in the school. Now Dan's father was a strict man and had very strong views on fighting. He did not approve of his son fighting for the sake of it. He strongly disapproved whenever he believed that his son had started a fight. But if his son had been fighting to defend himself, defend his honour, or indeed his family's honour, then that was okay. And this is something that we'll come back to with Dan. This is something he did quite a lot. Anyway, so by the age of 13, he'd been at school for a while. He was relatively well educated by the time, the standards of the time, and he was ready to leave school and start making his way in the world. So he did. He left school and he was placed in an apprenticeship with a glass cutter in London. But it wasn't going to go smoothly. Just like most things in Mendoza's life, it wasn't going to work out the way he hoped. It turned out that the glass cutter he was apprenticed to was a man who liked his drink. Well, don't we all? And he spent most of his time in local taverns and hostelries, leaving his son, who was older than Daniel, but not a master glass cutter in his own right, leaving his son to run the business. Dan Mendoza was not the sort of person who liked to be pushed around by people he didn't think had any right to. So the two of them didn't get on. And it wasn't very long at all before they came to blows. As you would expect, based on who we're talking about, Daniel Mendoza beat him bloody. In his own words, he gave him a thrashing. Then he resigned his apprenticeship and left. He did, however, manage to find another job. He took a job working for a greengrocer, and that lasted for a little while. Apparently, he tells us he enjoyed this job, but he regularly managed to have fights against other tradesmen who insulted his Jewish faith. And this is something that we're gonna hear a lot as we talk about Daniel Mendoza, is that he was hugely defensive of the fact that he was Jewish. He was very proud of his heritage. And to be honest with you, when you look back at the history of the Marranos Jews, you can understand why. In the 15th century, right at the very end, in the 1490s, an edict was passed, the Alhambra Edict was passed, which effectively expelled Jews from the Iberian Peninsula. and it made it illegal to be a Jew. And those who stayed practiced their Judaism in secret, and they became known as Maranos, meaning forbidden. Interestingly, I quite enjoy studying etymology, and the word Maranos is quite interesting because whilst at the time it very much meant forbidden, it actually has connotations that are linked to swine and pigs, and over time it's become an insult rather than simply meaning something that's forbidden. But anyway, so that was the heritage, and we can be certain that, bearing in mind how proud Dan was of his Jewish heritage, how proud his parents were, and the fact that they sent him to a Jewish school within this Maranos Sephardic Jewish community, that he was fully aware of this, and he went out of his way to defend the honour of himself and his faith at every possible opportunity. So whilst working as a greengrocer, he started to develop a bit of a reputation as a fighter, but he was still pretty small. I mean, he was young at this point. He was a teenager still, so he wasn't fully grown. But he was a very small boy. He was small and dark and had a Mediterranean look. And he was very agile, he was very fast, but he was very, very good with his fists. After he left his job as a greengrocer, he went to work for a tea dealer. And this is where life started to change for Dan. At the age of 16, he had his first proper fight. And this is a lovely story. One day he was working in the office with his master, and a porter came to deliver some tea. Dan offered him a pint of porter, a dark beer that was often given as a tip. But the porter who delivered the tea, for some reason, took umbrage at Daniel Mendoza. And he decided to pick a bit of a fight. Whether he knew Dan's reputation as a fighter, or whether he just thought he could pull a bit of a fast one, whether he was offended at the fact that Dan was obviously and proudly Jewish, we don't know. But what we do know is that the man in question refused the offer of beer and went so far as to demand double his pay in order to release the tea that he'd brought. Clearly, Dan said no, and Dan's master, who was also there, said no. But the porter got quite aggressive and threatened to fight them. Now, you can tell what's going to happen here. Dan, a young lad, stepped in and said, no, to his master. You don't have to fight him. I'll fight him for you. And we can see at this point that Dan was clearly quick to decide to fight. The two of them stepped outside, and an impromptu ring was formed in the street. And a very, very lucky coincidence happened. A man by the name of Richard Humphreys happened to be passing. Now, Richard Humphreys was a gentleman, and whilst he wasn't a professional fighter, he was a professional boxing instructor. He taught other gentlemen the arts of boxing. And he offered to stand as Daniel Mendoza's second when he saw what was going on. So a ring was formed, the two of them stepped in, and Daniel Mendoza stepped into an official ring with an official second for the first time in his life. He was 16 years old, and he was facing a fully grown man in the prime of life who was involved in a physical trade. He was a big, strong man. The fight lasted 45 minutes before the porter refused to fight anymore. Very quickly, the fight became the talk of the town. Everyone knew about this, partly because Dan was so small and young and had fought so successfully, and partly because Humphreys was relatively famous too. And Humphreys decided at this point that he'd probably found a real protege. So after a little bit of time, he'd managed to persuade Dan that he ought to fight again, and he could earn some very good money by fighting. So another fight was arranged, this time with a man, we don't know his name, but we know he followed the trade of coal heaver. You can probably guess what that is. I don't know for certain, but it sounds like a fairly arduous physical task. Another big, strong man. But this guy had a reputation as a fighter as well. He wasn't just an aggressive porter who happened to like fighting. This was a boxer. This is somebody who'd fought before. Dan he wasn't keen, he tells us. I find that hard to believe, to be honest, based on what we know about Daniel Mendoza. I don't believe that he wasn't a little bit keen. But he tells us that he didn't really want to fight. But he'd become friends with Richard Humphreys at this point and didn't want to let him down. So he agreed to fight. And this was the first time that Daniel Mendoza had fought for money. Now originally, the last fight was a proper fight. There was a ring, there were seconds, they fought according to accepted rules. But it didn't really class as a professional fight because no money changed hands, it was for honour. This time, however, the fight was for money. He was seconded again by Humphreys and the two men stepped into the ring and they fought. This time, the fight took an hour. And this was almost to become pretty standard for Daniel Mendoza. He was very skillful, he was very fast, he was very agile, he was very accurate, and he had an unusual way of fighting. He tended to slip and dodge and avoid blows. He tended to counterpunch a lot. He liked to close inside people's guard and he liked to throw them. And it was relatively new. To see somebody this agile and this mobile in the boxing ring was something a little bit special. But what that meant is that because he was a small man fighting much bigger, stronger men, fights tended not to be over quickly. They went on for a long time. And sometimes he took a fair amount of punishment on his way to winning. But win he did. And again, he won this fight pretty conclusively. The story is that at the time, somebody who knew Richard Humphreys and had trained with him called out to Humphreys, "Why don't you show him how to punch?" And Humphreys replied, "He doesn't need me to teach him, he already knows it all." Dan was quite happy, Humphreys was quite happy, and life seemed pretty good. Dan had a reasonable job and another way of making money on the side. And he was developing a real reputation as a good fighter, and he'd started to mix in some of the higher echelons of society. But it turns out that the tea dealer that Dan was working for had very similar morals to Dan's father. And whilst he was very happy for Dan to fight to defend his honour, or to defend the business, or to defend himself, he was not happy for his employee to fight just for the sake of fighting. So, on hearing of this fight, he immediately sacked him. And what that did at that point is it set Daniel Mendoza on a path that led him to the absolute pinnacle of boxing. He was at that point a professional fighter. And he regularly did other things throughout his life to supplement his income. But from that moment on, from the day he was sacked by the tea dealer, he was a professional fighter. And we're going to hear a lot more about that in the next video. So I apologise that we've only got up to age 16, but there's a lot to talk about with Dan. So keep your eyes peeled. Video 2 will be coming out relatively soon. If you've enjoyed this video, please subscribe to my channel. Please hit the thumbs up down below and leave me a comment. Let me know what you think. Have you heard of Mendoza before? What do you think of him? Do you have a favourite story? I'll tell you mine in one of the later videos. It involves gambling and furniture. Also, if you can, please check out my Patreon page. I don't know if you've come across Patreon. Patreon is a system where you can effectively become my patron, much like the boxers of old had patrons that helped them when they fought. In the same way you can support me making videos like this for YouTube to enable me to keep them free and available for everybody. From as little as $1 a month. I'm not going to stop making the videos, so don't feel you have to, but I'd really appreciate it if you did. Martial arts is my main income, it's what I do for a living. Making videos on it, writing about it, teaching it, all sorts of things. So please check that out. And in the meantime, watch some of the other videos, check out some of the other stories of greatness. There's some really interesting ones. The one on Jack Slack is particularly popular. Anyway, I'm off now, and I'll see you soon. Take care.